Imagine your house is on fire, but instead of checking for flames, you're just measuring the smoke in the air. Sounds insane, right? That's exactly what happens when doctors rely on hemoglobin A1C to assess metabolic health. The real problem is insulin resistance, but hemoglobin A1C just measures the aftermath. By the time it's high, the damage has already been happening for years, and it gets worse. Today, I'm breaking down why hemoglobin A1C isn't enough, why the oral glucose tolerance test is far more effective, and the test you should actually be asking for if you want to catch metabolic dysfunction early. So, what is hemoglobin A1C, and why does your doctor care so much about it? Hemoglobin A1C is a blood test that measures how much sugar has been sticking to your red blood cells over the past 3 months. Think of it like checking how much caramelized sugar is coating a batch of popcorn. You get an average of how much sugar has been floating around in your bloodstream. Doctors use it to diagnose diabetes. Under 5.7%, you're normal. Between 5.7 and 6.4%, that's prediabetes. Over 6.5%, that's full-blown diabetes. Seems simple, right? The problem is hemoglobin A1C doesn't tell you how your body's actually handling sugar. It just gives you a rough estimate of your average blood sugar levels, but averages can be misleading. If your hemoglobin A1C is normal, it doesn't mean you're in the clear. You could still be insulin resistant for years before your hemoglobin A1C even starts creeping up. That's because hemoglobin A1C is a lagging indicator. By the time it starts climbing, insulin resistance has already been brewing under the surface. You can have sky-high insulin working overtime to keep your blood sugar looking normal, and your A1C won't budge. It's like your car running on fumes, but the gas gauge still says half full. And it gets worse. Hemoglobin A1C can be falsely high or low depending on how long your red blood cells live. If your red blood cells stick around longer, which happens on low carb or carnivore diets, they accumulate more glycation, making hemoglobin A1C look higher than it really is. If red blood cells die off faster, whether from iron deficiency, B12 deficiency, or inflammation, hemoglobin A1C drops artificially low, completely missing the problem. Iron deficiency anemia alone can inflate hemoglobin A1C readings by up to 1%, making someone look pre-diabetic when they're not. And here's what almost nobody talks about. Hemoglobin A1C only measures glucose glycation, but fructose glycates proteins 7 times more aggressively. If you're pounding fruit smoothies and sodas, your tissues are getting wrecked, but your hemoglobin A1C won't reflect the damage. Worse, there's no routine test for fructose glycation, meaning if you live on high fructose foods, your doctor is flying blind. So if hemoglobin A1C isn't cutting it, what should we actually be using? If you want to know how your body actually handles sugar, the oral glucose tolerance test is the way to go. Here's how it works. You fast overnight, and then at a clinic, you drink a 75-gram glucose solution and get your blood sugar tested at 30, 60, 90, and 120 minutes. This test catches insulin resistance years before hemoglobin A1C does. This mimics real-world glucose spikes instead of giving you a static number and shows how well your pancreas handles glucose in real time. But here's the catch. Most doctors only check glucose during oral glucose tolerance tests, which is like looking at highway traffic but ignoring all the wrecked cars on the side of the road. The real fix, get your insulin levels measured during the oral glucose tolerance test. This tells you if your body is overproducing insulin just to keep blood sugar looking normal. If insulin spikes too high, you're insulin resistant. Even if glucose looks fine, if insulin barely moves, your pancreas is burning out, and diabetes is on deck. Research backs this up. A 2021 study in diabetes care found that over 50% of people with normal fasting glucose and hemoglobin A1C already had insulin resistance when tested with an oral glucose tolerance test and insulin measurements. Another study found that post-meal glucose spikes were a stronger predictor of cardiovascular disease than fasting glucose alone. Most doctors won't automatically order these tests. You need to ask. First, fasting insulin, ideally, you want it under 6. If it's over 10, insulin resistance is creeping up. Over 20, that's full-blown metabolic dysfunction. Second, an oral glucose tolerance test with insulin measurements. Get glucose tested at 30, 60, 90, and 120 minutes alongside insulin. This test will expose insulin resistance years before fasting glucose or hemoglobin A1C can. And finally, fasting glucose. Still useful, but it's a late-stage marker. Ideally, it's under 90. Pre-diabetes starts at 100, and diabetes is anything over 126. Doctors focus on glucose numbers, but the real problem is insulin resistance. If we don't check insulin levels, we're just treating the symptoms, not the disease. Hemoglobin A1C is useful, but it's not enough. The oral glucose tolerance test plus insulin test is the best way to catch metabolic dysfunction early. And if your doctor won't test fasting insulin, find one who will. Metabolic disease isn't a blood sugar problem, it's an insulin problem. Until we start testing for insulin resistance, people will stay in the dark until it's too late. If this video opened your eyes, hit like, share it, and subscribe for more hard-hitting breakdowns of metabolic health myths. Keep your insulin low and your standards high. Until next time.